Hello everybody and welcome back to another video from the Theory of Racelessness. Before the clip, we have some very exciting news. Dr. Sheena Mason, Dr. Carlos HOYT, and Greg Thomas present Resolving the Racism Dilemma, a full-day conference coming up this September 24th, 2022. Register using the link in the description box down below to experience these leading voices as they explore and discuss how to correct the misguided notions of race. Now, enjoy the video.
Show that people subscribe to the current ideology mostly because they don't know there's a different way to do it. They just don't know. And when they know, more often than not, they feel connected with it. But it is really a matter of giving people a different toolkit, and which is the same as saying, like, giving people this other information. And that simple action translates and reverberates in ways that, like you said, we can't even fully wrap our heads around. And the last thing I'll say too is it's interesting because racialized white people are taught in our societies not necessarily see themselves as white, right? Because they don't have an affinity for their race identity, usually, unless we're talking about, white supremacists, white nationalists, right? But that's such a small minority. And so what's really interesting in how this discourse has progressed to this year, very recently, I'll have the most resistance from racialized white people in terms of both skepticism and eliminativism, because I think there's fear, and maybe you can tell me is with the one with the psychological training, but I think there's fear of being on the wrong side, in quotation marks, of this thing called racism. And so I think my experience has been that people fear being misconstrued as being racist because, if I adopt this different way of viewing this thing, because I'm white, people are just going to jump on me,
Exactly.
Even if I think it's right, they're going to jump on me, they're going to call me racist, and then that's going to be the end of the conversation. I might lose my job, and so on and so forth. But again, with the right amount of evidence and discussion, which is critical, 9 times out of 10, they come around and they have a hard time seeing a different way forward as well. But they might not be wed to their race in the ways that other people who aren't racialized as white can be. But I think the way the emphasis is on racialization and race and all of that, the increased emphasis, as you were saying, does start to pigeonhole people into their whiteness, and that's not good. I don't know how else to say it. In simple terms, that's not good. Like, we need to be doing the opposite in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that sentiment. And I think particularly in our context here in Ireland, the discourse is going towards, like you were saying, that sort of super progressive area, progressive in quotation marks, in which everything is not everything. I'm in the EDI, we call it here, the DEI space, and it's becoming very racialized, and it's becoming this space where, like you were saying, a lot of people who are racialized as white are becoming fearful of in being critical about issues as such, and of fear of being targeted or said that they're racist and things like that. So I think once we start to really deeply reflect on how we can undo this idea of race, and yes, it's there in the theory of racelessness, that we can have it. And unfortunately, it's not been being taught at all in universities here. It's the super progressive sort of wavelength that we're on here. And once I found out about, I used to call it like conscious color blindness, where you're aware of the histories, but you don't want to be like put in the box of race. But once I found your theory, I was like, I need to send my colleagues this. I need people to read about this, and I need us to have more nuanced perspectives of issues of race, racism, and explore alternative schools of thought. So it's really nice to see the work that you're doing, especially and the workshops, your papers, your publications, and it's really nice to be able to share, have words for my skepticism, I guess. So have words for my for the thoughts that I was having in my head, and like you were saying, there's a lot of fear out there as well for people to deviate from the wavelengths that are being taught in mainstream society or are being taught in institutions, particularly here as well. So I think once we have that sort of body of work that people can be like, hey, what I was saying has some points to it here, it can give people the strength and the courage to step outside of the box of race in their mind and in their wider group as well. But I think there's still a lot of fear between people who are racialized as white and racialized as black to deviate from the group, to have alternative perspectives, because especially for young people, it's really hard to not be seen as one of us in this sort of sense. So yeah, I just really like your work, and really going to be engaged with it moving forward. I'm going to be sending it to my colleagues in the university so students can have more language to understand alternative perspectives to race.
Thank you. I will say too, it's one important thing to add, because you were talking about how humans essentially need some form of group identity in a way. That's kind of what I was translating you as saying earlier. And so once you start to dig into and trouble and interrogate group identity, such as what is perceived to be race or racial identity, yeah, it's like danger, fight or flight in a way, because it's like intuitively and subconsciously people recognize that the core of their being is now being questioned, right? And potentially at risk of being destabilized. And so for me, it really is important to know and understand and acknowledge how people get to where they are in terms of the emotional connectedness to race. And also helping people understand that I'm advocating for the undoing of racism, which is a very particular thing. Racism masquerades as race, but race is also what people point to and say this is race or this is racial. They're misnaming ethnic or cultural things. So that my skepticism, when I say race doesn't exist, but racism does, that's really what I mean. It's racism masquerading as race or misnaming other things as race. So that when I talk about undoing race, then I'm really talking about undoing the conflation of those things to undo racism. So everything that people find very meaningful and valuable in terms of group identity or just individual identity remains, as I said. And the only shift is the removal of the violence of racism, which also includes not helping people stop internalizing racism while still empowering and encouraging people to recognize the problem in the existence of racism too, but just not internalizing it, because the internalization I find is something that's really detrimental, as we were talking about earlier.
We hope you enjoyed that highlight. To watch the full version, use the link in the description box down below. Before we go, here's another reminder for Resolving the Racism Dilemma with Dr. Sheena Mason, Dr. Carlos HOYT, and Greg Thomas. We highly encourage you check out the great things being offered at this conference, September 24th. All of the conference information is linked down below. We hope to see you there.